Hello, everyone. I'm Eugenia Roussou, the Principal Investigator of ReSpell, and this is our second podcast. I'm very happy to have here with me the co-PI of the project, Anastasios Panagiotopoulos. Welcome, Anastasios.
Thank you, Eugenia. I'm also very happy to be here and have the opportunity to spell out a bit the main concepts and ideas of ReSpell. I hope in a brief and clear way, so that the following podcast would be a bit more in depth for more specific themes of the project. And I also would like to thank all the future listeners of the podcast.
We're sure going to have more podcasts coming where we'll analyze more all about our team members' ethnography and have guests. But for today, let's start by discussing about how we began to get inspired about the project, about ReSpell, and also about one of its main concepts, that of transreligiosity. Do you want to start?
Yes, I will try to go back a bit to try and remember the process, because normally we remember key events or milestones, as we call them in the projects, and we tend to forget the more processual dimensions of how some things distill down to a concept, an idea, a project, finally. And I remember, because of our then research and being colleagues in the academic environment of Portugal and Lisbon, we started sharing our research without any aspirations of a tight collaboration. On the contrary, I think we both felt that we are doing relatively different things, although in the very general sphere of religiosity, spirituality, but we were interested in each other's research in a way, in an autonomous way. So I think this was the initial process, whereby at the moment I had conducted research on Afro-Cuban religiosity, that is, religious traditions of African origins in Cuba. I was already thinking about a relative change in research, not on the theme, but on the geographical region. So I had conducted almost 10 years research on Afro-Cuban religiosity in Cuba. And then I was interested in researching Afro-Cuban religiosity in a European context, and more specifically Portugal and Spain, particularly Spain, because of the historical connections between Cuba and Spain. And because of this change of context, there were some significant differences between Cuba and Spain. One of them being that Afro-Cuban religiosity in Cuba, although institutionally marginal, it was historically very established. We're not talking about, let's say, a new age phenomenon, but something that was on a vernacular level very popular, although institutionally marginal, since the colonial period of Cuba. And the big difference of Afro-Cuban religiosity in Spain was that it was marginal in all senses. Not only on an institutional level, but also on a popular level. Even also, I could say that with quite a few classic stereotypes against black magic, let's call it like that. But at the same time, a part of the Spanish population or the immigrant population in Spain, being attracted to that, even or maybe because of the stereotypes that were following them. But at the same time, I realized that a set of other apparently very different practices were encompassing Afro-Cuban religiosity in Spain. And I started coming into contact with what one could call, although also criticize, as New Age or contemporary spirituality. And I think that's where the point of overlapping started to begin with your research, Eugenia, if you want to briefly explain that, your research, I mean.
Thank you. I will try to briefly explain it. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that we always had in common in terms of our research. This wider context of studying religion and spirituality from different perspectives and in very different geographical contexts. As my own ethnographic focus has always been Europe and Portugal and Greece, more specifically. And as it happens with many colleagues, and also with many colleagues that turn to be friends, we are too focused on our own researches to realize, that there are all these pathways for collaboration ultimately. And I think that, we kind of delayed quite a few years, after our postdocs to actually begin to think about both of our researches and what they have in common. My focus had always been for 20 years now, this relationship between institutional religion and more specifically Christianity, Orthodox Christianity in Greece and Catholic Christianity in Portugal, and its relationship with, let's say, more traditional healing practices of that use a lot of religious symbolism, such as the evil eye practice. And gradually, I kind of moved my interest to the so-called New Age spiritual phenomenon and the holistic health movement. So let's say both of which are considered to be, in quotation marks, alternative forms of contemporary religiosity and healing. And this is where I began to focus my attention in the last decade. And I think that this is, where we began to kind of discuss. I believe since 2018, it was where we both got our contracts work contracts here in Portugal, and we began to discuss in more detail, how our researches could kind of come together and formulate a greater research project. And I believe it was within this context that we actually also, in more recently, we decided to do this application to the foundation, to FCT, to the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology. And we actually wanted this keyword, this concept, to accompany our project and the title of the project as well, but also accompany our own work. And because we both felt, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we needed this new concept, as we had already studied and used all these really useful and helpful concepts within the anthropology and social scientific study of contemporary religiosity. But we felt that something was missing in a way from the bibliography. So yeah, this is more or less how the discussion on a new concept began, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are various elements that we had very clear in our mind, and that both in our researches, but how we viewed religious phenomena in general. which were trying, and I think there were two words that in one way or another, explicitly or implicitly, were reappearing all the time, and that these terms were the act of transcending borders and transgressing. So both terms have this trans element, and I think this is what eventually led us to think about transreligiosity, along with the concept that you have also come up with and used a lot of elasticity, which in one way or another all point to a more flexible, elastic treatment, both analytically but ethnographically as well, because exactly we try to theorize and analyze through the ethnography. So these things go hand in hand, of borders. And I think two basic dimensions of this elasticity and transgression of borders. I will leave aside the term transcending, because as a verb, it might point to transgression, but as a noun, transcendence might point to exactly the opposite. So let's leave aside this. But we started conceptualizing religious phenomena and spiritual phenomena, as you said, not in contrast, the one with the other, as transcending or transgressing borders. What kind of borders? And I think the two basic kinds of borders are, firstly, between what is officially, commonsensically, this is something that has to be nuanced, but for the objectives of this podcast, let's say commonly understood as religion, and what is understood as not pertaining to religion. So one dimension is that. And the other dimension of transgression of borders is among different religious practices. This second dimension has been termed as syncretism. But I think that transreligiosity is able to encompass much more, a variety of phenomena and practices which go beyond syncretism as well, which is a term that has also been criticized as well. So in these both dimensions of transgressing borders between what is thought to be religious and what's not, and among different religious practices, is, I think, a core element of conceptualizing transreligiosity.
It is quite interesting what you are mentioning about the verb transcending and transcendence, because, my first postdoc project was entitled Religious Boundaries in Transcendence. And at the time that I invented this title, I was not thinking, obviously, transcendence, in Christian terms, because what I was proposing basically is to see exactly this transcendence of religious boundaries, from a conceptualization that we have of religion as connected to the institutionalized religion, and how religion can be creative and move towards a transformation and towards new directions, such as the New Age phenomenon that I was about to begin to study here in Portugal. So yeah, that's a quite interesting, way to reconceptualize or deconceptualize as well, some verbs or some concepts and terminologies that can be stereotypically connected to Christianity. And I also remember that in one of our first discussions where we're talking about, that would be, it would be very cool, let's say, in non-academic terms, to discover a new term, to begin to work with in our with our research projects, and to be able to kind of also introduce the literature. I remember I proposed initially the term neo-religiosity, obviously very much inspired by my own work and the neo phenomena of contemporary religiosity and spirituality, because my work is quite a lot based on spirituality and healing. But then the neo, would have the same problems academically, but also analytically, that we know all the neo terms can have. And I believe this is the reason why we decided against it. I also, in the last years, my research project has been about transnational religion. So it always had this trans part of it, of transgressing borders, and how borders, or how spiritual and religious borders can have this openness and this elasticity, as you mentioned. And at the same time, I was also thinking about the term elasticity and how useful it could be, because exactly it points to the flexibility of contemporary religiosity and to the creativity of it. And maybe I will mention very briefly, and I think that this is one of the first things that I try to describe to you, how I kind of perceive this elasticity. And we have to say at this point that would you have a special issue on spiritual elasticity and crisis that is published in the journal Religions, where we kind of explained in much more detail about how elasticity and transreligiosity can relate to each other as well. But I remember this metaphor of these elastic bands, that can stretch or they can break. So, and I kind of used this metaphor in my head to kind of think about how also vernacular religious practice and the spiritual healing I had been studying all these years can actually, be applied ethnographically and analytically as well.
One of the values of the concept of elasticity and of transreligiosity as well is that it is quite encompassing and has room for diversity. And because when we thought and decided on this term, after that we realized that there was a theological movement being called transreligious theology, and then we thought, wow, this term already exists. So we started looking at this at the bibliography of transreligious theology. So we took it into account into our introductory article in Social Compass. And of course, we tried to differentiate ourselves on what sense that transreligious theology tries to create a unified, universal theological project. So of course, it has a big merit that it creates interreligious dialogues, so that, let's say, all religions are treated on an equal basis in this dialogue. But at the end, this is the means to, ideally, as we understand transreligious theology, to end up to a great universal religion that on the one hand respects all religions, but on the other hand creates a big unification and universalization of religion. Now, this is a theological project, almost a religious project. So we find it a very interesting project, but in terms of our understanding of transreligiosity, it is one among many other phenomena, and not so new either, that can be understood as transreligious. We could understand as transreligious a very remote magical religious practice in a very remote Amazonian tribe, although it's very problematic to understand in the present any remoteness of any social or cultural group. But let's say anthropology has dealt with that a lot. It can describe that because borders don't even exist. So whatever we understand for these remote practices as transreligious is on an analytical level, because they don't even make these distinctions. They don't even make any borders to transgress. So where is the transgression? But on an analytical level, we can still understand them as instantiations of transreligiosity. But then we move on to a set of other practices and beliefs that are very contemporary, very global, or however you want to call them, which exactly because borders exist, they are also transgressed. So there are also these two variations of transreligiosity, one of borders being ignored and one of borders being transgressed exactly because they exist. And I think that the elasticity also concept illuminates that.
One of the most important aspects, I believe, of transreligiosity is the fact that it goes far beyond the study of phenomena that can be considered as syncretic, as you mentioned, or as interreligious. So we're talking about, let's say, phenomena that do combine, mix together different religious spiritual traditions, but at the same time, they offer a deeper level of transformation and of creativity, isn't it? I mean, for example, I can think about my own research and my own fieldwork, both in Portugal and in Greece, where there is the strong element of transnationalism. For instance, many of the spiritual healers I have worked with and I have followed, they do travel, for example, from Greece or from Portugal to Brazil or to Peru or to the Amazonian, and they do acquire indigenous, let's say, spiritual and religious knowledge, which they bring back and then incorporate this in their own practice. So there is also this constant communication between the global North and the global South, if we're allowed to use these two terms, which is one important aspect of transreligious practice, this act of transcending and transgressing geographical boundaries, and where the element of transnationalization is very, very evident. But at the same time, it's this mixture of different religious, spiritual practices, but not so. Because let's not forget that one of the most important aspects of the project is well-being, and this is not because it's not relevant, obviously, on the opposite side. These practices that we're studying in the project and transreligiosity is defined through this unexpected, let's say, in many ways, links between what is religious, what is spiritual, and what is considered to be part of a more generalized well-being, especially with regards to therapeutic practices that criticize, let's say, the institutionalized health system, which is that of biomedicine, while at the same time offering a critique against institutionalized religions. So this is, this is something that I have found a lot in, or if not exclusively, in my own research. So I don't know if, Anastasios, you have something similar to share from your own research.
Absolutely. This is the thing about my transition of the research from Cuba to Spain, but still on Afro-Cuban religiosity, and ultimately leaving aside a bit Afro-Cuban religiosity and going on to my current research, which I have to admit it poses more methodological challenges as well. And I will explain what I mean. In Cuba, you have these established, although marginal in institutional terms, Afro-Cuban religiosity, where, let's say, the sacred, the divine, to begin with, it's not monotheistic, it's polytheistic. It also includes spirits, not deities, spirits of dead people, which are tailored to one's personal environment and biography. And it has to do a lot with well-being, both initiations, all the consultations of the oracles, and all the actions, the ritual actions that were followed. The focus was on the personal context. I used personal instead of individual because the personal includes the individual, but also goes beyond the individual and has to do with the more intimate personal environment of the individual, if the individual is the focus. But the main characteristic is that, let's say, the sacred was taken for granted. There was not a quest for the sacred. What was not taken for granted was the relationship with the sacred, and that just because you are a believer, in quotation, in inverted commas, just because you're a believer, then well-being is more or less guaranteed to you. The well-being was not guaranteed. You had many times, it comes as a surprise, the affliction, the opposite of well-being. So there was a constant need to communicate with the divine or the spiritual dimensions, so that to achieve well-being constantly. So this means that to be a believer does not solve the issue of well-being, but you have to constantly achieve it. And sometimes afflictions come as surprise, even if you are initiated in Afro-Cuban religiosity. Now, what I think is quite different, and this poses methodological challenges as well in the European context, is that not even the sacred is taken for granted. It is part of the quest. So there is a parallel quest for the divine and for well-being in an alternative, let's say, way than the strictly biomedical, institutional well-being, which goes hand in hand with the quest for the divine and the quest for the self, or for a community that achieves and provides this well-being. So the methodological challenge here is that we are enmeshed in this context as researchers, as anthropologists. We might even be afflicted by the same issues that bring our ethnographic subjects to do what they do, to this quest for well-being. So it's a much more challenging situation, both for us as researchers and anthropologists, because in one way we are enmeshed in this context of the quest for well-being, but also for our subjects as well, because the going beyond the transreligious quality of these practices might be confusing, firstly, for our own ethnographic subjects, but also for us analytically. What is religious? What is not? And here I will mention, let's say, a concrete example of some sessions of family constellations I have been present in Greece, but also here in Spain, where you saw it's very hard to describe this as a religious practice. Many people, both as subjects, but also, me discussing about these practices, I don't know, to my family, to my friends, to my colleagues, the reaction of many people is that this is not a religious phenomenon. Why are you including it to religious phenomenon, family constellation? This is pure psychology. But this is exactly the challenging thing, because I find some elements which, let's call them religious, spiritual, or metaphysical, this miraculous element in these sessions, which try to bring forward issues and events of the past that has happened to a specific person, while the rest of the group acquires roles. It's like a role-playing game, where the rest of the group acquires roles of the context of the person that is under focus on this session. You might very easily describe it as a psychological, dynamical thing. But from the discussions I've had with the people that were present, they keep the miraculous, let's say, understanding of the session is also present there. And I'm not talking about the fact that in these sessions there might be, a statue of Buddha, which implies a kind of more spiritual and religious aspect in what is going on there. But the experience itself, which is thought, understood by the subjects, that brings things to the surface, information, messages, like an oracle, in which this information would not be possible to be retrieved in any other ways. And it goes beyond the psychologization of what is going on, although it doesn't go against it. And I think this is a very characteristic aspect of contemporary Western trans-religious phenomena, of making the self part of this quest for the metaphysical and the sacred.
For sure. What you're mentioning, it's really, really interesting, because one of the most crucial, perhaps, aspects of what we're studying through transreligiosity is these elements of surprise. Where do religion, spirituality, and well-being connect creatively, but creatively in new ways as well? Because obviously many religious practices do have this element of well-being. You go to, for example, to the church, as many of my interlocutors have told me, to pray for a problem of health. Equivalently, many of my interlocutors and many people in general that I have spoken to do practice spirituality and energetic therapies and other forms of spiritual therapies, exactly because they do come from, they do have to deal with a serious or less serious health issue. So there is obviously this connection, but there are practices you just mentioned, with a constellation that are not, let's say, in front of us, like screaming, yes, I'm a spiritual therapeutic practice, but they do hold this element. But also in the more evident, let's say, religious, spiritual, therapeutic practices, they also do hold this transreligious surprising element, and this is what we're trying to find. But also, you made me think about how we as anthropologists use the self-reflexive aspect, which is surprising for us at some point, in the sense that, for example, and this is also very transreligious, our point of view, and surprising because we do try to, let's say, be more objective, which never happens during our fieldwork. But then we try individually as well as anthropologically and ethnographically to deal with our own selves, within the research. So, I mean, for example, we do quest our own transreligious pathways. I mean, speaking about myself, I did have to start challenging myself to think more about what I considered throughout my research as part of fieldwork and as part of my individual spiritual and health pathways. Because one of my main methodological, let's say, strategies is, and I believe, one of the methodological strategies that many of anthropologists who study religion and spirituality follow, and medical anthropologists as well, is to kind of go and feel and sense and perform all these practices, that has to do with spirituality and healing. And in that sense, while practicing spirituality, healing, and well-being, we are faced with these choices. What do we do for ourselves? What do we do for fieldwork? And how do we combine these two aspects of our anthropological and personal identity together?
Absolutely. And here I think that the issue of self-reflexivity is not straightforward in many senses. Of course, on a very personal level, to us, it's very important what our experiences, feelings, emotions, ideas, whatever is, in general, in our lives, but also in during our fieldwork research. Now, the thing about that is about self-reflexivity, and I think this is what I mentioned before, that we are enmeshed in this context, is exactly that we are talking about a context which is, let's say, in the quest of well-being and experiencing a kind of affliction. And I think that to be self-reflexive, and I think we will touch upon it in the last part of our podcast now, is not to create an argument for transreligious phenomena on a personal level. We can be open self-reflexively, but we are going to talk about a bit the dark sides of transreligiosity. So I think we both agree that we don't want to give the impression that we are preaching out with an academic vestige how good and how perfect is transreligious phenomena or contemporary spirituality.
But you mentioned that in relation to the individualized forms of practice. So this is what I didn't really understand what you were trying to.
The individualized forms of practice?
In relation to the anthropological self-reflexivity, but it is part of our own ethnographic itineraries, isn't it?
Exactly, and
So we
that
cannot negate this part, but obviously there is the other part, that trans-religious practice does have this, as you mentioned, darker element, that not everything is perfect, obviously, in this ethnographic world. But no, just to make sure that, not to kind of...
yes, no, exactly. What I wanted to say, that the self-reflexivity aspect is not exhausted, not negating our
Wow.
selves. The self-reflexivity aspect is also what I mentioned before, that we are dealing now with a more generalized context. So the self-reflexive approach can be to a more generalized context, which has to do more with ourselves, more with the West, let's call it like that. That's what I wanted to highlight again. Self-reflexivity means not to feel suppressed, to negate yourself, your presence in the field, but it also, self-reflexivity can be to be self-reflexive about your own society, your own, which anthropology does in any case.
And let's not forget that one of our methodological strategies in ReSpell is autoethnography. So we are literally doing that in most of our research projects within ReSpell, isn't it?
This has to be, developed. Not, I mean, autoethnography is not something that clearly describes one thing. Exactly, because we are talking about our implications in the field. The implications in the field cannot be of one dimension, Well, that's what I mean. That it's not straightforward what autoethnography is. It's a challenge. You know what I mean? So, what I was trying to convey was that the self-reflexive aspect, which goes even to the point of being autoethnographic, as being an important part of our project, of not negating the anthropological but also more personal self in our researches, also challenges the fact that the individual and society is kind of in contrast, or in opposition. That's why I was referring to the self-reflexive, both importantly as an individual experience, both for our ethnographic subjects, but also ourselves as researchers, but also the fact that we can be self-reflexive in a more general perspective of a context that, if we talk about contemporary Western context, of which is also important thing in our project, of a context in crisis, which has begun from the socioeconomic crisis in 2008, 2007, 2008, has been accentuated. Importantly, and here comes even more into the surface, the well-being and alternative therapies are experienced through the COVID-19 phenomenon, and the continuing crisis that the West, and especially Europe or South Europe, is currently undergoing. So there is a more dynamic and complementary dialogue between the individual experiences, our own experiences, and more generalized perspectives of a context. And here we can even be able to even describe dark sides of transreligiosity, or contemporary religiosity, exactly because we're talking about crisis. So there must be a dark side in a context which is understood as a crisis, which can be very well more deeply analyzed in following podcasts.
Yes, because at the end, we are transreligiosity is about transgressing borders between, as you said, what's individual and what's social. what's an anthropologist as a researcher, and and who is an anthropologist as a person? What is religious and what is spiritual? How the health and well-being enters into the dialogue and messes up with all the elasticities and the elastic boundaries, etc. But also we can go back and recreate a boundary, isn't it? It's also a possibility. So hence the dark side of transreligiosity, because obviously with COVID especially, we have seen cases, ethnographic cases, where people have actually gone back and drawn their religious, spiritual, and therapeutic boundaries for various reasons, which, as you said, we'll analyze in future podcasts in more detail. But it's also, one important aspect of ReSpell. Not studying just the positive, let's say, side of transreligious practices, but also study, or maybe we shouldn't even refer it as, dark, light, positive, negative. It's they're all sides and parts of this concept and these practices that we have named transreligious conceptually wise.
Exactly, and I think that here talking about a bit more of the general context, I think that some elements, especially in a Western context, predominate quite a lot, and one is this generalized mistrust, which is part of the quest to the alternative. So you have on the one side in a mistrust in institutions. In our case, the basic institutional mistrust is to the religious institutions. This doesn't mean that you go against, let's say, a monotheistic understanding or experience, but you go to the institutional aspect of it. So you have written a lot in your book with the evil eye in Greece. You don't counterpose Christianity with the evil eye, where the ethnographic subjects go beyond and not necessarily against monotheism and their monotheistic traditions, by being more open where the institution is not so open. But this mistrust to the institutions, I think, is also much more generalized and thus important to deal with the biomedical field. Hence our discussion and interest with COVID, the political institutions in general. So you can see a general context of mistrust and the quest of the alternative. And this is, I think, where it becomes very sociologically astute, what we on a more individual level are referring to crisis, the personal experience, the quest for well-being, and which can also, bring into the surface the dark side, let's say, of the crisis itself. Not to try to see what is good and what is bad in what we are studying, but to be open to all this mistrust and trying to go beyond the problems that create this mistrust.
And on that note, thank you so much, Anastasios, for this great discussion. I think we both hope that it was relevant, useful, or interesting to whoever has decided to listen to how the project was inspired in the first place, what transreligiosity means to us and to the project, and all these different and challenging at times, but certainly worthy of further research aspects of the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugenia, for this great dialogue, as always. And of course, the listeners who have had the patience to listen to us.
Until next time.
Until next time.